out, and thank you everyone for coming out and to come and learn about bats. Yes, I do. I work with the Alberta Community Bat Program. We're actually a program of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada, or WCS Canada. That's our nonprofit that we work under. The program was put together by Alberta Environment in 2016. So we're a pretty new organization, and we're small too. There's only a handful of people that work with the program, doing the coordination of the projects and the citizen science stuff that I'm going to talk about. So yeah, we're going to go through this and figure out how you can help bats. Oh, now it's not. Oh, let me give you a laser pointer, that helps. And there we go. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a bit about the program and tell you what our objectives are. We have a citizen science project that I'll talk about. We'll talk about why there's a conservation concern around bats and their economic importance. We'll talk about the species that we have in Alberta and a little bit about their ecology. We'll talk about threats to bats. And then we've got a couple of projects. One is about bat-friendly farming, and another one is bats and bridges, and I'll talk about that a little bit tonight. And I'll finish up with bats and rabies, and then what we can do to help bats. And then we'll do questions at the end. So any questions you have, this is your chance. And yes, I've been working a little more than 19 years. My master's degree was in the early 1990s. So yeah, I've been at this way too long. So the program's mission is to raise awareness around bat conservation issues, and to help, hold on, and to help the local communities manage their bats in buildings if they come up with, when they have issues of bats in buildings. And a lot of people want to put up bat houses, and so they talk to us about, what's the best way to put them up and the best designs, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. And we also are engaging in a few research projects now. We've sort of moved into that just to monitor bat populations in the province and to better understand what our bats need and if there's issues for our bats. So the components of the program is we do things like this, events where we do bat talks. We used to go into schools. I'll be doing Zoom presentations with some little kids this week. But we do try to get out and talk to school kids as well. The Citizen Science Project is a roost monitoring project where we engage people who have roosts at home or bat houses, and we get them to count bats and then submit bat guano samples. So that's our Citizen Science Project, and they count their colonies repeatedly in the summertime and over a few years. And it's kind of like the backyard bird count for bats, which, if you know anything about the backyard bird count data, a lot of people kind of thought it wasn't going to amount to much, but now that they have many years of it, they've actually been able to ask scientific questions from that data, and it has told us a lot about some of the little species that don't usually get a lot of attention. So it can be really important, these contributions by just people who are naturalists and are keen to help out on a project. We also have a bat-friendly communities guidebook, and we encourage people to take on not only bat-friendly actions in their backyard, but in their communities. So we have resources on our website, and we continue to develop those that are free for use. So we have a few guidebooks that you can download that are on our website. The research that we've got going on this past summer, we're looking at we were collecting a lot of bat guano. That was really what our summer was about, because we weren't really allowed to handle bats. COVID kind of put a wrench in a lot of bat research. So we ended up collecting bat poop from everywhere. So, but from bat poop, you can figure out what bats are eating. And some of the genetic methodologies have advanced to the point where we can tell species of insects that they're eating. So that's really interesting. And we can also identify the species of bats from bat guano. So we're looking at how to improve our understanding of species distributions within the province. And like I said, with the monitoring that we're doing with the Citizen Science Project, it'll be that population data that we get from the bat house counts. And we're also monitoring for white nose syndrome, which is caused by a fungus. And we can look at the guano again and see the extent of the spread of the fungus within the province. And spoiler, it's not in Alberta yet, but it's coming. So we're quite active on social media as well. We're getting up close to 4,000 followers on our Twitter and Facebook, and we have Instagram, and we newly added a YouTube channel. So if you find our YouTube, you just look for @Alberta Bats, and there's a bunch of small videos on there about bats, and they're excellent. We have a fellow from Lethbridge who is an amazing videographer who's also very keen on bats, and he has some great video that we've been funding him to put together some stuff for us, and it is really exceptional. It's quite good. I'm quite a fan of what he's been doing. So this is some of these are some of the resources that we have on our website. So we have a series of guide books. One is specifically targeted to managing bats in buildings. This one here. It tells you how to, if you have bats in your attic, there's ways of excluding them that is a bat-friendly way to do it. And it's more about timing the exclusion. So you wait until after the bats have left in the fall, and that's when you do your bat exclusion. So all the details of how to do a bat-friendly exclusion are in that guidebook. And so we try to get people to not do that kind of thing in the middle of summer, because most colonies that are in buildings are females with their pups, and the pups are not flying yet. So when you start doing exclusions of bats, you can end up leaving the young behind and causes mortality. And you can have quite a large impact on the local bat population if you do an improper exclusion. So the details of how to do an exclusion that's bat friendly can be found in this free guidebook. We have a guidebook on building homes for bats. Lots of people are interested these days in building bat houses, but not all bat houses are the best for bats. We've had instances where there's been overheating in events in bat houses, to the extent that the young pups have died. We found dead bats underneath bat houses if they've gotten too hot. So there's designs that work better and locations for bat houses that work better. And we talk about that in that guidebook. So you can get lots of details in there. And we also have free bat house plans, so you can build your own bat houses. And although we do have two types, this is the rocket box here, and this is the 4-chamber maternity box that's on the front of the guidebook. We haven't had that much luck with this rocket box in Alberta. It tends to do well in the east. There's been people that have done some work on this style of bat house in eastern USA, and they had really good success with some of the small myotis. We haven't seen that in Alberta, and it's more these 4-chamber nursery boxes that, and not on poles, on buildings, seem to be the best option for our bat houses in Alberta. And that might have to do with our climate, the amount of wind we get, and just the variability in temperatures that we experience in Alberta. So the last guidebook that we have, that our big guidebook is is one of the more recent ones, is on building bat-friendly communities. This is a great book, and it has lots of information about each bat species and their distribution. So it's a bit of a guidebook for bats. It also talks about hazards that might exist in your yard for bats, and what you can do to eliminate those hazards. There's a bit on how to garden for bats. So there's a plant list of native species that you could plant. That basically it's plants that help support moth populations, because that bats eat moths and insects, and so it's those native plant species that promote insects is what you want to plant. So there's some that are better than others that are for bats. So there's a list of that. And there's a few other things about their ecology, things that you can do to make your backyard a little more friendly, like keeping it dark and the size of water features that they might need and stuff like that. So that's a good book too that you can download for free. Our most recent books that we've produced have been this one is for educators. It's targeted to younger grades. It's a coloring and activity book, and that one's for free on our website as well. And then we also did some work with pest control operators in both Alberta and Saskatchewan. And we put together some best practices suggestions for them. And that again goes around that bat-friendly exclusion techniques and how to manage bats in buildings. And we just did a survey. We had funding and did a survey of pest control operators in the 2 provinces. And they're happily to report they seem very open to learning more about bats. They do have some room to learn. There are some things that people are doing that we'd like them to do differently, but they seem very open to learning how to be more bat friendly and to promote our best practices guidelines, our best management guidelines. So that was good. That was a good experience. So the citizen science project, some of the results that we have from the past few years, most of the bats that we get reported to the program from this the citizen science project are little brown bats or big brown bats, which isn't too surprising. Those are the 2 species that tend to like to use buildings. There's a couple of other species like long-legged and long-eared bats or long-eared myotis that could be using buildings, but they haven't shown up yet. And it might be just that that they may be just a little rarer. And if we get more people sending us bat poop, we might be able to detect them. Not everybody sent us a bat poop sample, but the ones that did, you can see the purple triangles are the little brown myotis and the green squares are the big brown bats. And we actually did pick up a silver-haired bat from a guano sample as well. So that was kind of interesting. But yeah, 2/3 of the sites were little browns and the rest were big browns mainly. So, and we have a lot of reports from the city corridor, which is, Edmonton, Red Deer, and Calgary. Recently, there's a new group that's up in the Peace River area called the Boreal Nature Network, and they're bat fans. So I think they've been promoting the Citizen Science Project and trying to get people to report their roosts and to do some bat counts. And the Waterton Biosphere Reserve, there should be a few more triangles down here. I need to update my map. And the Waterton Biosphere Reserve Association has had a campaign to get the local farmers and the people in the Biosphere Reserve who have bats in their buildings or have bat houses to do bat counts and to submit bat guano samples and to talk about and report their bat houses too. So we've got a bit of coverage here. We still have a bit of an empty space here, which is unfortunate because we really like to get some bat roosts that we know of that we could monitor in this part of the province. And we're a little empty here. And of course, the north is always a challenge. It's hard to get data from up there. There's just not very many people up there. So the anticipated outcomes of our citizen science project is that if we have known roosts, if we can come up with treatments for white nose syndrome, then we might have some colonies that we could work with. We are working on a project in British Columbia with our Wildlife Conservation Society Canada biologists and Thompson River University. They're working on a probiotic treatment for bats. So what they did was they swabbed. It's a picture of a bat being swabbed, their wing being swabbed, and they're getting species of fungi and bacteria off of the wing, and then they cultured them in the lab and created a probiotic of the healthy microflora that occur on bat wings, and then reintroducing that into a maternity colony in late season to sort of give them a boost when they go into hibernation. And I'll talk a bit about white nose syndrome in a bit, so you'll better understand how that works. But the monitoring, we need to know how our populations are going to be affected by white nose syndrome. So the roost counts and the guano sampling under bridges will give us an idea of if there's white nose syndrome there. And NA BAT is a acoustic monitoring program, and we're also doing some acoustic monitoring, and that data all goes into a North American bat monitoring program. And so then we can look at relative abundances of bats using acoustic sampling. We're hoping to have improved building management from both pest control operators and homeowners. And will just have better habitat enhancement guidelines around bat houses from some of the data that we get from our citizen science as well. So bats, we'll just talk about bats now for a bit. So all of the bats on the planet belong to the order Chiroptera. Chiro means hand and ptera means wing. And if you guys can stick your hands out, I can stick my hand, I always get the wrong way here. So stick your hand out and you put your thumb up and you spread your fingers out. That's what you're looking at here. So this is the bat's thumb, and each of these are finger bones. It's just their fingers with the wing membrane that goes in between. And this is the pinky finger. And then the membrane goes all the way down to the ankle, and that makes the wing. So here's their forearm, their elbow, and the shoulder. So this is the upper arm. And that's what makes up. So we can tell a lot about bat's health by looking at the wing. You can see signs of white nose syndrome. There'll be scarring or patches of white under a special light. So we can tell if bats have been infected. You can tell the relative age of a bat, if it's like a first year bat or an adult bat, by just looking at the knuckles. So these little knuckles in their fingers, in a juvenile, they tend to be long and slender, and that's because they're still growing. And in adults, they tend to be round and bony like this that you can see. So we can tell a lot by looking at a wing, and bat wings are pretty cool. So it's kind of fun to look at. And that's what Chiroptera means, hand wing. Now, a lot of people think of the bat as the bat, but we do have several species in the province. Alberta actually is home to 9 different species, which always surprises people too. It's a very diverse group. Across Canada, we have 18 species. British Columbia has the most species. Depending on what day they count, it's anywhere from 15 to 17. They have a couple of species that they've detected just acoustically and have never captured. So some people like to count 17, and then if you just go by the ones that have been captured in the province, it's more like 15. So, and then there's another species that only occurs in the east, a couple of species actually in the east. So we have about 18 species in Canada. But worldwide, bats are incredibly diverse. 1/4 of all mammals are bats. They're the second largest group of mammals on the planet. The only group that has more species of animals is the rodents. In bats, we have over 1,400 species. I have to keep checking the number because every time someone goes to a tropical area, they find new species. I think the last count was 1,439. But yeah, that's gone up since it goes up every year by at least a half dozen or so bats. So global diversity is amazing. I mean, a lot of people think of bats as these little dark brown, mousy looking creatures. When you start looking around the planet, you look at ear sizes, ear shape changes, they get face shape is changed, the size of eyes change, feet adaptations. All of our bats eat insects in Alberta and across Canada. They're all insect eating bats. This is an insect eating bat from British Columbia, the spotted bat. It has the largest ears for its body size of any of the bats on the planet. This is a crested free-tailed bat from Africa. And just the males have this little crest on their head. Nobody really knows why. They think it's to impress girls. And you have these bats that have these crazy noses. It's called a nose leaf, and it's involved in echolocation. This is a horseshoe bat, and it has a very elaborate nose leaf. Of course, the vampire bats. Most people know about vampire bats, but there's out of 1,439 species, there's 3 species of vampire bats. And this one is being fed. I think this one lives at a zoo, and he's being fed from an ice cube tray. So you can get an idea of the size of this animal. It's quite small. And the 3 species of vampires are all just little guys. It's one of the bat biologists' pet peeves is to go to a vampire movie or a horror movie, and they show these bats flying, and they're giant fruit bats, and they're calling them vampire bats. You usually hear in the back, "That's a fruit bat," you know, if there's a, so we always get mad about that. But the vampire bats are actually quite tiny. This is a new species that they found in the Sudan area of Africa. It looks like a little panda. I've forgotten what its common name is actually now, but yeah, it's a very cool little looking little bat. We have bats in the tropics that eat frogs. As a frog eating species. This is the foot of a fishing bat. There's bats that catch fish. And then there's a whole group of bats. Out of that 1,400 or so, there's about 250 to 300 species that are nectar feeders or fruit eating bats. And these bats play an important role in seed dispersal in tropical systems. They actually have a nickname of the night gardener. They're really, and some of them are really important in pollinating some of the tropical fruits we enjoy. There's some other species that are nectar feeding in the southern US, and they're involved in pollinating the agave cactus, which is involved in the production of tequila. So you have to thank bats for tequila. And then the insectivores have an incredible impact on insect populations because they can eat their own weight in insects in a night. So bats around the world are doing jobs at night that most people are completely unaware of. But they're a conservation concern. So I'm going to tell you why they're a conservation concern. So in lots of different languages, the bat is known as they're known as the flying mouse. In Germany, they're called the Fledermausen, which means a flying mouse. In French, it's the chauve-souris, which means either a hairless or shaved mouse. Lots of languages, they kind of refer to them as a little mouse. Well, they are the size of little mice. And when you think of a mouse or rats, they will give birth to large numbers of young at a time. And most of these animals, these species, will give birth to pups. They'll have a litter 2 or 3 times in a summer, but they have a short lifespan. They only live maybe 2 or 3 years if they're lucky, but they produce a lot of babies. Versus a large mammal, large mammals usually have really long lifespans. They usually produce small numbers of young, maybe only 1 or 2. And it usually takes a long time before those young can reproduce. Well, bats, weirdos that they are more like grizzly bears than they are mice. So I always tell people if there's a thing that I'd like you to take away is that I want you to think of bats not as flying mice, but as little flying grizzly bears. Because they only have 1 pup each season and they only have the 1 litter. Half of those pups don't make it through their first winter because they hibernate. All of our bats, well, most of our bats are hibernators, and even in the migratory species, there's very high first-year mortality. So you only get half of them that actually survive to the next season, and they can live a long time. The record is about 42 years for a bat. I think that one was actually from the UK, from a banding record. We actually have the longest lived little brown myotis record from Alberta, and that was a banding record that was recovered from Cadman Cave in Hinton. And that little brown myotis was 39 years old. This is a bat that's about 7 to 9 grams, and it can live to 39 years old. It was at least 39 years old, which is amazing. Now, the consequence of having a small litter size, high overwinter mortality of first years, and living a long time is that they're set up to have a slow recovery of populations. So when you lose a local colony, you can impact a local population for a long time. It can take decades for populations to recover. So whenever we have something that is having a large impact on bat populations, it's a cause for concern because they just can't recover very quickly. Now, and pups, when they're born, they're called pups. They can be 25 to 30% of the mother's body weight at birth. So if you put that in human terms, that'd be like humans giving birth to a toddler. Like they're huge babies compared to the mom. But our little insect-eating bats, they don't carry their pups with them when they fly around at night hunting. So the babies can be left behind right after they're born. They're born with really big feet and they're left in the roost to hang with all the other pups. And mom goes out and hunts for a bit and comes back and nurses. And then they fly out and hunt again and they come back and they nurse them again. So that's how they manage the pups. It takes about 4 4 or 5 weeks for the pup to get to adult size. And then it takes another couple of weeks for them to learn to fly and hunt on their own. So it's a bit of a race. Once pups are born in the spring, they usually are born starting around June, because they have to get those pups up and flying and able to hunt for themselves so that they can get fat enough and put on weight to make it through the winter, which is probably why they have such a high mortality rate over winters, is that there's probably lots of pups who don't get it all together fast enough. And being Alberta, sometimes the weather changes on them and they just can't put the weight on. It gets too cold and there's no insects flying. So hopefully this summer was really warm. We had a warm fall that we have some high overwinter survival of young bats this year. So bat reproduction is also crazy. So right this past September, October, that's when mating occurs with bats. So we don't know where they hibernate. We know a couple of places, like we know that cave up near Catamount, but it only has at the most about 1,500 bats in it. So that's certainly not all the bats that are in Alberta. We think that most of them are using deep rock crevices where they can get under the frost line. So they will go to the place. They generally in the east, what we see is that the bats will show up in the areas where they're going to hibernate. They call those swarming sites. And that's when all the mating occurs. And the males continue to mate with the females after they've gone into hibernation. But that's a tricky strategy because if the males stay active too long, they can use up all their fat reserves. And if there's no insects to eat, they could starve to death if they don't go to sleep early enough. So all the females have mated. The females store the sperm over winter. They have a special lining in their uterus that keeps the sperm viable. And then when they come out of hibernation in the spring, that's when the females ovulate. And that's when a fertilization and implantation occurs. And so like they only eat insects. So if we have a cold spring, they've woken up and they've left the hibernation site. They're moving towards their summer site. If it gets cold, what they can do is they can do like a semi-daily kind of hibernation called torpor, where they drop their body temperature and their metabolic rate, and they save energy that way. But if they go into torpor while they're pregnant, it actually slows the fetal development. And gestation in bats is about 60 days, but it can vary it can go 2 weeks or more longer if it's a really cold spring and the females are using torpor a lot. So it's a bit crazy. It's not fixed. It totally depends on the weather and the behavior of the bats of when the pups are going to be born. So yes, everything is complicated with bats. Oh, now why is it not? There we go. So our Alberta bats, like I said, we have 9 different species. 3 of them are considered long distance migrants. The hoary bat and the red bat. Here's a red bat in the middle. They are long distance migrants. And then silver-haired bats are sort of a longer distance migrant, but they tend to migrate and then hibernate. The red bats and the hoary bats will go as far south as, well, we're not exactly sure how far south they go, but we think it's either the southern US or they may go south and then go to the coastal southern US and stay active year round. We're not really sure what they do. And then the other 6 species are shorter distance migrants, and then they are definitely hibernating in the province. So these are the migratory species, and they're beautiful. Like most people think of bats as these little dark brown or black creatures, and here you've got red bats. I mean, the males are fire engine red. They're very red. The hoary bat here in the middle is our largest species we have in Canada. They're around 35 grams. They have a fairly large wingspan. We call them sky lions because they have this yellow ruff of fur around their face. And they're called a hoary bat because of the frosted appearance of the fur. It looks like hoar frost. And then we have our silver-haired bats, which are fairly abundant actually in Alberta. And they have the silvery tips on the fur, and they can range from like a chocolatey brown to a black color. These two, they roost high up in trees on little twigs, and they roost by themselves. They're solitary roosting bats. The silver-haired bats, they will use cavities in trees, and they usually form small colonies of 8 to 15. So there's never a big colony of silver-haired bats anywhere. So here's just a picture of a little red bat all hanging off a little twig, usually smaller twigs than that one. I think that one's been posed. The hoary bats and the red bats have a furred tail membrane, and because they're roosting in these exposed situations, they will actually wrap their tail membrane around them like a little furry blanket, and they become completely invisible when they're hanging up in trees. They look just like leaves hanging in the trees. And in the east, this bat is actually called the eastern red bat, but it occurs all the way to the west. They really need to change the common name on it. But in the east, it's fairly common. It's more common than, it's fairly rare in Alberta, quite common in the east. And in the east, like eastern US, they find it actually sleeping and using torpor on the ground in leaf piles. And you can barely see this. He's this little red bat hiding amongst the red leaves, which is pretty crazy. The hoary bat and the red bat, they are unusual because they will almost always give birth to at least twins. The hoary bats give birth to twins. The red bats, they can give birth to up to 4 pups, and nobody really understands their reproductive ecology well. We're not sure how they manage to do that, because it's a huge energy expenditure to raise a bat pup, and these red bats are doing something. It's actually unusual across all 1,400 or so species of bats to have a litter size that large. So they're very strange bats, and we really don't know much about them. Difficult to study. It's a small bat. They're roosting 35, 40 feet up in a tree on a little twig. They're running around in the night. They fly really high. They're hard to catch. We can put radio tags on them. They're starting to get better with radio tags that have more functions on them so that we can get a little bit more information, but very challenging to study. This is the silver-haired bats. Now, these bats, they're listed as sensitive in Alberta because they rely on old trees. So because they're so reliant on forests, and there's impacts on our forest from forestry, Alberta listed them as a sensitive species because they need a little extra habitat management to maintain those older trees, older age class trees that they roost in. So the resident bats, we have a big brown bat. There's 6 that aren't the migratory species, the 6 ones that stay around year round. So there's the big brown and 5 Myotis species. So we have, Myotis just means mouse-eared. They used to be all called bats, and then they changed the name to Myotis. I think just taxonomists, they love to change the names up. But we've got the little brown Myotis, which is currently still the most common species that we have. Northern Myotis, Western small-footed Myotis, long-legged and long-eared Myotis. Here we've got a picture of a little Myotis that's hibernating. You're wondering, this is like a little popsicle. They tend to pick hibernation sites that are high humidity and very cold, 0 to 9 degrees Celsius, very, very specific conditions for hibernation, but they sometimes will frost up, so they look like a little popsicle. This is a long-eared bat, and the 2 species of long-eared bats are this northern Myotis and the long-eared Myotis, and they both look really similar. They're similar in size, similar in color, and they both have long ears. There's just tiny details that discriminate the 2. And this is a little Western small-footed Myotis, which are totally cute. They're only about 4 grams, blonde with a little black mask. And we'll talk about them a little bit more in a minute. So big browns are considered secure in the province. The populations are secure. They don't have a lot of protection. They're a fairly abundant species. They're really important because of the numbers of insects they consume. These guys are sort of beetle lovers. They love to eat beetles, but they'll eat moths and all sorts of other insects as well. But they could be really important as far as especially things like corn or field crops that have beetle infestations. This could be the little guy that's out there at night eating the little beetles. They're fairly flexible in their roosting. They'll roost in trees. and in rock crevices. And they also will use bat houses, and they will use buildings for roosting. There was some radio tracking done in the grasslands area. The western small-footed myotis and big browns were both found using this crevice that this arrow is pointing to. So a big rock crevice with a space underneath it. It's probably facing a warm direction. So this probably got nice and warm. And those species were roosting under that rock. The little brown myotis and long-leggeds are very similar in size. They look almost identical. How we tell them apart is we measure the length of this forearm. We look for a little feature on their ankle. It's a little piece of cartilage that sticks out along the edge of the trailing edge of the tail membrane. And it's called a calcar, and it can have a little flange or not. It's keeled or not keeled calcar. So it's like there's just teeny little details that you have to look at, and you almost always have to have them in the hand and take all these measurements to discriminate between the myotis species. They're quite difficult to tell apart. Now, the little brown myotis currently is listed as endangered in Canada, and that's because of white nose syndrome. In Alberta, I think they actually have changed it from secure to maybe at risk. I think that they're currently reevaluating those populations. We don't have white nose syndrome yet, so our bat populations have not been impacted that we know of. It hasn't shown up in our data yet, and we haven't found the fungus in the province. So we think our populations are still quite good. So the province hasn't changed their provincial status of that species, but it's actually listed as endangered in Canada. Long-legged Myotis volans. This is he's a funny little bat. We don't really, not too many people have studied him. He's not that common. He looks very similar to the little brown Myotis, but we really don't know that much about him. So across Canada, like the federally, he's listed as data deficient. Alberta, they've listed his status as undetermined. But some of the work that has been done around white nose syndrome is they've looked at Myotis volans, and they think this species may be susceptible to white nose syndrome. So it's a real concern because we don't really have that many. We don't know of any sites really where we can find long-legged Myotis. We'll have no idea. We don't know where they hibernate. We'll have no idea if the populations are impacted or not, or to what extent, because we really have no idea what the population sizes are. So it's one of the ones that we're trying to figure out how to actually get a hold of and figure out a little bit more about population data, but it's very difficult. Both of these species will use buildings, they use rock crevices, and they use trees. So they're fairly flexible in their roosting, which is always a good thing because specialists are always a little bit more trouble to work with. The northern Myotis, Myotis septentrionalis, he is listed as endangered across Canada, so federally listed as endangered, and maybe at risk in Alberta because they have this reliance on trees, old growth trees again. So because of the forestry impacts, Alberta had recognized the species might need a little extra management to keep populations safe. You can see the distribution. He follows the boreal across to the north and the west. And that's the kind of habitats that we find them in. Again, we don't know a ton about this species. Actually, our provincial coordinator worked on them for his master's. So he had some where he radio tagged and found them in trees and looked at movements of females. And so we do know a little bit more about this one. But yeah, currently listed as endangered. And I'll talk a little bit more why when we talk about white nose syndrome. And then we have long-eared Myotis that almost look identical to the northern Myotis. They're, like I said, they both have long ears. Like, look, so that long ears, brown, long ears, maybe a little more blonde with a black face. I don't know. I always say I'm never sure which one is which. You kind of have to look at the little tragus in the ears, and there's a slight difference in the length of the forearm. So there's some little, again, you have to kind of have them in the hand to be able to tell them apart. So the distribution of the long-eared Myotis, it's not up in that northern boreal, so it's a little separate from the the northern Myotis, but there is a bit of an overlap when you get them in between here, sort of just north of Red Deer and south of Edmonton. They could both occur here, but they tend to be more south. And this species and the northern Myotis, they have the bigger ears because they actually listen for their prey instead of echolocating and flying around and hunting insects. They're called whispering bats. So they're not yelling all the time because some of their prey can, like moths, can hear them coming. So they tend to not yell, and they listen for the insects crawling around on leaves and on bark surfaces. And we kind of suspect this one might be eating grasshoppers. And I'd really like to, get somebody to study them and catch them in southern Alberta when there's like a grasshopper outbreak, and just we'll see how our bat diet analysis goes. But you could just take some poop samples after you catch them, and then send them off for analysis and find out if they're eating grasshoppers or not. So I think people would be happy if we found out they were eating grasshoppers. But the Evotis is a little more flexible in their roosting. They will roost on rocks or in trees, and they're considered secure in Alberta. Our smallest guy is this western small-footed Myotis. Like I said, they're tiny. They're like 4 grams, which is about the weight of a quarter. They're listed as sensitive in Alberta, mostly because their distribution is restricted to these river valleys in the grasslands region. So along the Milk and the Red Deer and the South Saskatchewan. Sometimes we find them a little away from this area as well, but along tributaries. It hasn't been inventoried extensively, so there could be a few data points that are outside of the purple that's supposed to designate where this bat's found. They tend to roost in rock crevices, and I'll show you more what to look for. So this is along the Red Deer. This is Dry Island Buffalo Jump, and they do live along here. There was been some work on them in this area, and they radio tagged them and found them going into these erosion crevices, which is more like it's not really a rock crevice. It's they call it mudstone. Because it's hard like cement in the summertime. And some of these holes, like in here, you see where the pen is poking, they can go back like a meter into the riverbank. And big browns and these little western small-footeds will use these crevices. And we think they're hibernating over winter in this kind of habitat too, in these areas, which is pretty interesting. So bats obviously are nocturnal. So one of the ways that we survey them and figure out activity levels is by using the fact that they use echolocation, and they're quite noisy at night. And we listen for their echolocation calls to get an idea of activity and species. So if you don't know what echolocation is, it's basically they're yelling really, really loud, and then they listen for the echoes that come back off of whatever's in front of them. And that could be like the trees, or in some cases, if they're in caves and cave walls. And but it's so highly developed that they can actually tell how big of an insect is in front of them. They can tell the texture of that insect, and they can determine how fast it's moving and in what direction. So it's a highly sophisticated way of navigating the night sky. And we don't see the world that we see the world through our eyes, but they see through their ears, really. So they're generating like images of what's in front of them based on sound, and they're incredibly loud. If we could hear bats echolocating, they're echolocating about 120 decibels. So if you had one like 10 centimeters away from your ear, it'd be like having a smoke detector going off right beside your head. And it's amazing, like a 7 to 9 gram animal can make a sound that big. That still always amazes me. But they're using high frequency sound. We can hear up to about 18 kilohertz. And most of these bats are between the power part of their call is between 20 and 40 kilohertz. So they're above our hearing range. So we can't hear them, but they're really, really loud. A little fun fact is actually when they're yelling that loud, the bones in their ear actually disengage when they yell so that they don't make themselves go deaf. And in like a fraction of a millisecond, the ears re-engage so they can hear the echoes coming back. It's that fast. It's repeatedly like yell, can't hear, then listening for the echoes coming back, the ears start working again. It's really incredible what has evolved in bats as far as echolocation goes. So these are the kinds of bat detectors that we've used to listen for bats. And basically what it does is they have really fancy little microphones. This is the microphone on this one. These two are for passive monitoring. You'd leave them out somewhere and they would just record for a day or nights at a time, all night. It takes the sound and brings it down to a frequency that we can hear. It records the sound information, and then you can actually discriminate between species. This one is like, it looks like a little transistor radio, and it's kind of like that. You tune into a single frequency, and so you can hear bats that only are at that frequency. And these three, they're called broadband bat detectors, and they will record frequencies, all frequencies that are detected. So they can do multiple ones at the same time. This little one is the unit. It's called an Echometer Touch. It plugs into your phone or a tablet. And this is I have a set of these units that I use for my bat walks. So if we ever do a bat walk, you'd get a tablet with one of these plugged into it. But they're only about $180 through Wildlife Acoustics. So it's actually not too expensive. I mean, it's in the range of a good pair of binoculars. So you could purchase one of these yourself and make your little smartphone or a tablet into a bat detector and go out at night, and it will give you an image of the call. It gives you could hear the bats calling, and it has an auto ID program on it that tells you what bat is echolocating. Now, some of the times it's guessing at what bat you're listening to, because some of the bats, especially the Myotis, the calls are very similar. So whether or not you're getting an accurate identification is questionable sometimes. So the data that those detectors are looking at would be the echolocation call frequency and then the shape of the call. So some of them have these sweeping calls or frequency modulated calls that go from high to lows, and when you hear it, it sounds more like a bird call. And so what these bats are usually hunting, or this one is a sweeping call with a piece at the end that's a constant frequency. These bats would be hunting in areas where there's lots of trees and shrubs around. And so each frequency in the call, each component is giving it different information. So it gives it more complex information. So in more complex habitats. These calls here, these straight flat calls, these are for bats that are flying in really high open spaces. So they're putting all the power into one frequency so they can get a longer range, so they can hear things further away. And they're not worrying about running into things because they're flying really high, and there's not a lot of vegetation around. So they can put all their energy into one frequency. So the bat detectors, they're basically comparing a library of calls and looking at the shapes of calls and the frequency, and then they're coming up with the identification. So the Myotis species are all echolocating around 40 kilohertz. Big browns are around 35, silvers around 30. These two sometimes overlap and are hard to distinguish. Hoary bats call around 20 kilohertz. They have a low voice. And red bats have a high voice, 40 kilohertz, but they have a shape call it's more like this constant frequency call. So the Myotis have 40 kilohertz, but they have a call that looks like this. And then red bats have 40 kilohertz, but they're like this. So that's how they tell the species apart. So if you can maybe turn up the sound on your computers or whatever you're listening on. I've got this is what you would see from using that Echometer Touch on your tablet. So these are actually the echolocation calls. So these are the sweeping calls. And this is what we call a search pattern, where you see a series of calls like this. This is the bats flying around, yelling, listening for an insect to fly by. And here he's detected one. And then what they do is they don't put as much energy into a single call. They put less energy into the call, but they make a whole bunch of calls really quickly close together. and it's called a feeding buzz. And what they're doing is they're just trying to maximize the amount of information they can get quickly, so they can figure out where the insect is in front of them and if it's moving in what direction, and so they can catch it. So the next slide, you should be able to hear the audible echolocation call. So listen closely. It does sound chirpy, sounds like a little bird, but you'll hear that. You'll hear the each call, the search calls, and then at the end you'll hear this little buzz sound. So listen for that. Yeah, kind of cool, huh? It's crazy to think that they're that loud, making noise like that all summer long, and we can't hear them. It's kind of a good thing that they're high frequency, because no one would get any sleep at night. But interestingly, your dogs and cats have high frequency hearing range. So cats and dogs can hear bats echolocating. So if you're walking your dog at night and all of a sudden it stops and it's looking at the sky weirdly, it hasn't seen a ghost. It could be actually hearing a bat flying over your head that you can't see and you can't hear. So next time you're out in the summer. So let's talk about the threats to bats. There's a bunch. The biggest one right now affecting our bat populations is white nose syndrome, which is a fungal disease that's been marching across North America, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Wind energy is impacting our migratory species in particular, but in some areas it also impacts the non-migratory, or the resident hibernating species can also be impacted by wind turbines. Habitat loss, both in terms of roosting habitat. Logging tends to take the older age class trees, unless there's specific management to retain some of those older age class trees. You lose the roosting habitat, because they need the oldest age class trees that have not only the large diameter, but they'll have defects like woodpecker holes or crevices, cracks from freeze thaw or rot spaces where branches have fallen off, or even under peeling bark. Some of the little guys, they like to roost underneath peeling bark. So you only get that in older age class trees. So you have to manage to keep those older age class trees. We also have habitat loss in terms of foraging habitat. When you lose wetlands or degrade wetlands health, and you lose those aquatic invertebrates that are emergent, those are a lot of the things that bats will eat as well. And if anyone's been paying attention, you know that insect populations are being recorded as dropping in different areas and different species groups, and it's not something that's being well monitored. Looking at insect population changes, it's really a difficult thing to get a handle on, but obviously losing insects is going to impact not only our bat population, but any of the aerial insectivorous birds as well. So we kind of lump ourselves in with the aerial insectivorous birds in that habitat loss, for especially for foraging habitat. Cat predation, remarkably, is actually fairly significant. They've shown that for birds, but in some areas on the planet, bats have been impacted. Even a single cat, outdoor cat, can kill a lot of animals overnight. And like I said, they can hear the bats. So if there's a bat colony nearby, a cat's going to know. And they can smell it, they can hear it. And it must be just fascinating for a cat. I know I have cats and I love my cats, but my cats are no longer, I no longer have cats that go outside. Catios are something we promote, or having cats on leashes, but trying to keep those cats from just wandering around at night is it's good for bats and birds. Entrapment, entanglement are two things that happen. We just did a survey of bats and farms, and I was actually surprised. Like, we have had incidents of reports of bats getting caught in rain barrels. You smooth side rain barrels, they can't get out, so they drown, so they get trapped in there. Or like empty buckets, they can fall in like a deep bucket, empty bucket, and they can't climb out. So that's in our bat friendly communities guidebook, and ways to sort of mitigate for those hazards. Entanglement, from the Bats and Farm Survey, we actually had a couple people who have seen bats tangled on barbed wire, which is, we've had reports of that, but we weren't sure how common it was. But they're small animals, and not all the time people are reporting things when they see them. So some of these things could be happening and we're not aware of it. Vandalism at roost sites can be a significant impact on local populations. If you have someone that goes into either a hibernation site and disturbs bats, or even like a maternity site, especially if you've got a larger colony, it can have a significant impact on a local population. So yeah, so all of these things, the loss of roost habitat, so that like all animals, they need a place to live, they need things to eat, and they need water, clean water to drink. And when you have impacts on these things, it can cause decreases in population. And we have not been good about understanding what the current population or past population sizes have been. So we don't really know what extent bats have been impacted by any of these things. And that was part of the reason the Citizen Science Project was put together, and the Community Bat Program was put in place, was so that we could get at least an index of population from our roost counts that we've got in place with the cooperation of residents across Alberta. So white nose syndrome, so I've been talking about white nose syndrome, but I haven't really told you what it is. It arrived in North America in 2006. Well, it probably arrived just before that. They think it took them a few years to figure it out, but they think it came from Europe, maybe on some dirty hiking boots. Somebody who was a caver in France or someplace. They may have had soil on their boots, and the fungal spores are tiny and very resilient, could be transported in soil. They found bats in a hibernation site in upper New York State with fungus growing on their face, and it made them look like they had this little white nose. So that's why they call it white nose syndrome. So it took them a couple of years to figure out what species of fungus it was. They've changed the name a couple of times because they had it wrong first. And then they traced it back to Europe, and they think a white nose syndrome type fungus went through European bat populations probably a century or two ago, and those populations are still in recovery. So we've always wondered why North American bat populations were always so much more, higher, like they're more abundant in North America than they were in Europe. Most of the European bat species are listed as endangered or vulnerable in some way because their population levels are so low. And it may be that white nose syndrome type fungus went through their populations, and like they're still recovering their bat populations. So it's arrived in North America. It's an invasive species. It's introduced from elsewhere, and it's being spread. We've got decontamination protocols in place for people who work in caves or work underground or enter hibernation sites. But we think most of it is being transferred between bats. So the bats, they go out in the summertime, and then they come back together from different areas, and they all hibernate together, and then they go back out. So it's moving. It's been moving about 250 kilometers every year from New York State, moving across North America. And the result was in Canada now we have 3 species that are listed as endangered. So this is the picture of a bat with white nose syndrome. It's got the fungus on the face, but it also infects their wing membranes and their tail membranes. And it's been described to me as it's kind of like an athlete's foot type fungus. It gets into the wing membrane, and it actually can eat through the membrane, and it can cause big holes and scarring. Sometimes you get bats that survive an infection. And in the East, what they're finding is the few bats that are surviving have become somewhat resistant, or they are actually just using different habitat now. This fungus, it's a weird fungus because it likes cold, damp places, which is where bats like to hibernate, and that's really specific cold temperatures, but damp. So they think that some of the bats in the East may be roosting in a little bit colder sites or a little bit drier sites that are not compatible with the fungus. So they're getting a bit of consistent survival of like little brown myotis in the east. But the impacts to the overwintering populations, this is just a pile of dead bats here. In the east, they have big hibernation sites with like thousands and thousands of bats in them, and they were counting their bats, so they knew how many bats were in there, and they were getting, for little brown myotis, it was anywhere from 90 to 95% overwinter mortality. So like 95% of the bats dead, and it would happen all at once. So you get this big pile of dead bats. The northern myotis that we have in northern Alberta, 98% mortality in their hibernation sites. Yeah, it's just terrible. And then there's another species in the east called the tricolored myotis. And again, it was having like those 90% mortality rate. So with the little browns, they're finding that they're getting 5 to 10% survival, and it's stabilized. So they're not seeing it dipping any further. So they think that maybe the bat populations are going to slowly start building again. But like I said, it'll take centuries. Like, it was funny because there's a guy that I went to school with at the University of Calgary who worked on bats, and now he's a professor at the University of Michigan in Kalamazoo, and he works on white nose syndrome stuff. And I saw him in a video and he offhandedly said, yeah, the recovery to get back to what we recognize as current population levels for little brown myotis, it could take up to 1,000 years. And I was just like, because you know it's going to take a long time, but when he put it in numbers, it even floored me. So it's going to take a long time for our bats to recover, but it's nice to see them stabilizing and maybe recovering, because then you don't have extinction happening, right? So this is just a spread map of the white nose syndrome. The little red X is where it first showed up. So the blue and the purple is when it first infected. And then you can see every year as it kind of marched across. And then a weird thing happened in 2016. That's the yellow. So they got this far across the continent. And then all of a sudden, they had a bat that showed up in Seattle, Washington, an infected little brown myotis. And they think it got a ride on a transport truck or something, or in a camper. And it moved from an infected population in the east all the way to the west. So now white nose syndrome has been moving north and south of that point where they found that bat. So it's moving bat to bat. So it's approaching British Columbia from this side and us. And then this is from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service map. It's called whitenosesyndrome.org, and they track all of this data. And so this is their map. So you can see it's just south of Saskatchewan. But some of the work that we did this summer, we were sampling bat guano underneath bridges. We did some sampling in Saskatchewan as well as Alberta, and it showed up in eastern Saskatchewan. So the furthest we had found it before was in Riding Mountain National Park in Manitoba. But in August, we picked up the fungus in eastern Saskatchewan, and then we had a few samples from southern Saskatchewan around Val Marie that also tested positive. So you can see it's getting closer to Alberta. So it's going to be here in the next couple of years anyway. So we were looking for some colonies down here. We did get a couple of bridges down here that have some bats in them. So we'll be going back and sampling that next year for guano to test for the fungus to see if it's entered Alberta yet. And but any of the samples that have been tested in Alberta have come back negative. So we don't think it's here yet. But it's good to keep track of it, because then we can see when it arrives. And then it's usually what happens is that you detect the fungal spores, and then it's the following winter that you get the infection really affecting the bats. And then that's when you see the populations drop. So if we keep counting our bats at the bat colonies, like the bat houses and other roosts, that's when we'll be watching to see if we get a drop in bat numbers. So we need more participation in the program too, but that's kind of the way it looks. So yeah, so I did mention the swabbing the bats, and this is them again swabbing the bats. So the naturally occurring fungi and bacteria that occur on the wings can actually outcompete and kill off the introduced fungus, the white nose syndrome fungus. So they had tested it on a captive colony in Kamloops, and then in 2019 they had applied it to a maternity colony of Yuma myotis in the lower mainland. And the idea was they were going to catch the bats in the spring when they came out of hibernation to see if they had elevated levels of the naturally occurring fungi on them because of being treated with a boost with this probiotic. But then when white nose or COVID showed up, then we were no longer allowed to capture bats because they were worried about the link between bats and COVID. So they've reapplied, I think, this fall at the maternity colonies before they broke up. And so this spring they will be capturing bats and continuing this work. But it sounds promising. And the fungi and bacteria that they are using in their probiotic, they have since done some tests in soil in different parts of British Columbia, and I think some in Alberta as well. And these fungi and bacteria are actually naturally occurring in soils too. So it's not like we're adding something new. It already occurs. It's just kind of promoting a higher level to give them added protection. So wind turbines are the other big thing that affects bats, and it can affect them usually during fall migration. There's about a 6-week period when the migratory species are moving out of their breeding area in Alberta and Saskatchewan and all across Canada, and they're moving south into the southern states. And they either get hit by the wind turbines, or there's a thing called barotrauma, which happens when the wind turbines, when they're rotating so fast, like the tips of those wind turbines, even at low speeds, can be moving over 250 kilometers an hour. And it generates areas of low pressure. And if the bats fly into this zone of low pressure, it actually causes their lungs to expand and rupture, and they end up with internal bleeding, and they just drop to the ground. And they were finding, like you can see this hoary bat on the ground, these bats wouldn't have any broken bones, and they couldn't figure out for a while what was wrong with them. And then they did little necropsies on them and found that their lungs were actually damaged from this barotrauma that they were encountering. But they do get hit by the rotors as well. And in Alberta, it's silver-haired bats that are experiencing a lot of mortality. But across their range, hoary bats are experiencing high levels of mortality. So this hoary bat, all these migratory species occur straight across North America. So they're across North America, they're being affected by wind turbines. So it's not just in Alberta, but across North America. The estimation is 500,000 bats are killed annually at wind farms across North America. And 38% of those that are killed are hoary bats. So it's a significant number. So when they've been looking at populations and they've been looking at projections, these 3 species, the red bat, the hoary bat, and the silver-haired bat, are all under review currently by the federal government. And I suspect in another year or so, you'll see that these 3 species are also listed as endangered, just because of the impacts that they're experiencing at wind turbine sites. So there's this and I said there was some modeling done. This is a 2017 study. This was Robert Barkley from the University of Calgary, and Erin Bearwald, who was his student. She's a professor at University of Northern BC now. And they modeled population levels, because we don't really know how many hoary bats there are, but they kind of did a low estimate of what the population would be, the highest population that could be, and sort of a middle one. All of their estimates came up with a problem. 90% of the population lost in 50 years, and extinction in 100 years or less. And this was based on 2017 projections of the number of wind turbines on the landscape. And after 2017, we saw a big increase in the number of wind turbine development. So they're expecting this to happen sooner than 50 or 100 years. It's more, the window is sort of backed up 20 or 25 years for both of these numbers. So we're quite concerned about our migratory bats and the wind turbines. They have looked at ways of mitigating the effects of wind turbines on bats, because I mean, wind energy is good. I mean, we need wind energy. It's clean, and it's, you know, it doesn't, you're reducing greenhouse gases and things, but it's not good if you're going to drive bats to extinction. So we've got to find better ways to mitigate. And most of these mitigation strategies are still only 40 or 50% effective. And they're not, the problem is that they're not being deployed at all wind turbine sites all across their range. It's sort of spotty. There's not legislation protecting the bats. Sometimes if they find a dead bat, it's only a single turbine in a field that will experience the mitigation methods that they have put in place. So the ways the general mitigation is that they try to pick a site where there's no bats, but we're not really good at predicting that. Curtailment is, there's a certain wind speed when those rotors kick in and start operating, and if they put the cut-in speed, which is when they start operating at 5.5 meters per second, it helps the bats because it's low wind speeds and warm nights when the bats are flying through. So it's usually less than 5.5 meters per second winds is when that's when the bats are moving. So if you can lock the rotors in place during that period when the bats are flying through, then you reduce mortality. But not everybody does that. It's a 6-week window. Some of the wind producers are more apt to do it than others. Like I said, there's no legislation making them do it. And again, if they do actually search for dead bats, and they will put in mitigation, but sometimes it's only at a single turbine, not at all of the turbines in a field. Feathering is when they change the pitch of the rotor blade, and sometimes that can help reduce the number of bats killed. And they're still testing using loud ultrasonic signals to warn the bats that the wind turbine's there. And you're like, well, how do they not know the wind turbines are there? Well, they found out that when hoary bats are flying south, they don't fly with they don't echolocate while they're flying. So when they're migrating, and they'll actually join other bats and they mate on their flight south, and they actually form flocks of bats, and none of them are echolocating. They're flying at a high elevation in open space, and they just are winging along, and they're not really paying attention. I don't know. I mean, they can still use their vision, but I guess maybe they're not seeing them. The other theory is that because the mating occurs during this southward flight, that sometimes what happens is hoary bats, they think the males and the females do this thing where they find a large tree on the landscape, and they fly around it with the male chasing the female until they like get it together and then mate. And maybe what they're seeing, they see these big wind turbines on the landscape, and they think it's a big tree, and they engage in this mating behavior around the wind turbine and then get hit with the wind turbine. So yeah, we're really not sure what's going on. And they've been studying it for as long as, like, they were studying this back in 1992 when I was still in school, and they're still trying to figure it out. So it's been a long time. So we have a couple of projects that we started this past year. One is the Bat Friendly Farming Initiative, and the other one was Bats and Bridges. We chose farms because farms do have potential impact on a large amount of the land base. So things that farmers are doing can affect bats. The three things that are most important, I think, as far as farmers and bats is for them to consider connectivity, because some of the bat species, if they like trees and stuff, they will actually follow. You see these windbreaks. The bats will actually they'll leave their roost and they'll fly along these things. So sometimes if they have to fly over a big open space, they'll avoid that area. So you can fragment habitat if you don't have these connectivity corridors for some species. It depends on the species. Habitat diversification, if you don't have a big, large monoculture, diversified landscapes seem to be better for bats, probably because you're getting different numbers of different types of insects that arise out of different plant species, and it kind of breaks up the temporal variability of insect production over the summer, and the retention of habitat features like big old trees. And some of this stuff can be done in the margins of fields and in areas that are not primary farming habitat on a farmland base. So there's things that can totally be done that don't even really cost money for the farmers to manage the bat habitat. Now, the other side of the coin is that bats, they've shown, have a huge economic importance for farming. In the States, they did some work, and the average value they came up with is $22.9 billion a year in insect control that bats are responsible for. So like I said, the females, when they're nursing, they can eat more than their weight in insects in a night. So when you've got thousands of bats on the landscape all out there eating every night, they're eating a lot of bugs. Now, these estimates range from $3.7 to $53 billion a year. They didn't account for the amount of pesticides that they have to buy if they didn't have bats out there eating the insects. So, and this estimate doesn't look at forestry either. So I'm sure that there's bats eating the insects that affect forests as well. So they're basically anything that flies at night is fair game for bats. So they're eating all these different types of insects, and a lot of moths lay eggs and things like in corn crops and other crops. And it's the caterpillars that do the damage. So when you've got bats that are eating these adult females that are moths that are about to lay eggs, removing those from the moth population has a significant effect, because it's removing thousands of potential larvae that could be growing and eating the crops. So I don't think we have still a really great grasp on just the actual value, but this makes you stop and think, right? And then they start putting in, trying to assess a dollar value with the economic importance of bats and their roles in not just ecosystems, but agricultural ecosystems. And another interesting study came out of Europe. They were looking at bats and cows, and it was not something that I had really been thinking about. But they had found that there were some bat species in Europe were hanging around cows and eating the insects that bother cattle at night. And then I just happened to have a conversation with some farming type people down at the Millerville Fair when I had my bat booth down there. And I had not realized just how important it is to control biting insects for cattle ranchers. And in as far as production of beef cattle and milk production, harassment by insects affects growth rates, and it significantly affects the health of cattle. So anything that's actually consuming these pests of cattle that's a benefit for cattle ranchers. So we actually started a project this past summer as well with the University of Calgary Veterinary Medicine department. As a new professor there, and he had a second year vet med student who was deploying bat detectors in pasture with cattle and without cattle. And we had little trail cameras on the posts where we had the bat detectors so that you could see if cows were near or if there was no cows near. So we have yet to really dig through that data. I wanted to put a bat detector on a cow, but they told me that cows don't like that. So we didn't get to do that. I still like to put a bat detector on a cow, but maybe someday. So again, the things that farmers can do is, think about connectivity, diversifying the landscape as far as vegetation or even crops, retaining the habitat features that bats need, like old trees and wetlands, and even margins where they retain or plant native vegetation. That helps promote native insects that not necessarily are bad pest insects, but just insects that bats can eat in between when they have, I'm sure when you have crops there's like an outbreak of insects. So in between the outbreaks, you need to have food for bats as well. So those margins can provide that insect abundance that they can rely on. And reducing pesticide use is another big thing. And some of our bat guano is actually going to Environment Canada to get tested for neonicotinoids because they're concerned about the effects that might have on bats if that pesticide is moving up through the food chain. So yeah, the Bats and Bridges project is just as what you might think. We're running around all over collecting bat poop from underneath the bridges. And like I said, you can get species identification, the presence of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome. We can look at diets down to insect species level. And also we're keeping track of the types of bridges and locations so we can figure out the types of bridges that are favored by bats. So here's a picture of our Edmonton coordinator. She's collecting some bat poop underneath a big bridge. So usually these abutments, there's a big flat surface area there, and you'll find bat poop laying there. So what the bats may be doing here is night roosting. So they'll go out, they'll leave their day roost where they have even a maternity roost, and they'll go hunting for an hour or two. Their bellies get full, and then they'll find a nice sheltered spot like under a bridge. And they'll hang out together and they cuddle in a group to stay warm. And then they just hang out, socialize, and poop until they're empty enough that they can go and hunt for another couple of hours and fill their bellies and then go back to their day roost for the morning. So these night roosts, there's poop. So it's kind of ideal. They've left us places to sample. So how can you help bats? The cat one's easy. If you've got cats, keep them inside. Or if they're outside, use a leash or build them a catio. I keep posting plans for catios on the website. Using bat houses or installing bat houses, especially in urban areas where we may have removed all those older age class trees. So there aren't old trees with cavities or cracks or peeling bark. In those places, that's when you need to add that alternate habitat is in the form of bat houses. Retaining those natural roosting features anywhere we can, that's important. Retaining and protecting the foraging habitat. So protecting wetlands, you guys going out and doing the garbage pick at a wetland. I mean, that's fundamental. I mean, that's helping to maintain wetland health. Protecting water features and retaining or planting areas with native vegetation. So even in your backyards, like I keep telling people, just even start with like a little corner and like plant some wolf willow and some wild rose and a few whatever other native plants you can find. I mean, there's lots of stuff that will grow, and you don't even have to water that stuff. You get it growing. I mean, it's drought tolerant, and some of it's actually kind of pretty. So think about putting in some native plants even in your backyard. Keep your outside areas dark in the summer. Don't leave lights on all night. If you do have like a safety light, you can always put them on a motion sensor if you're worried about keeping your house safe. I mean, just a motion sensor is a good way to do it. And then it's only bright when it needs to be. And keep learning about bats. I mean, I've been studying bats for, decades now, and there's tons to know. And we do have tons of questions that yet to answer about bats. And so now that you've listened to me yammer on for an hour, you know more about bats than the average person. So it's like sharing that information with other people. That's really important too. I always tell all the kids, anybody that I talk to, is like, now you're a bat ambassador. So now you have to go out and teach other people about bats, because most people they don't think about it, right? There's something that flies around at night. You kind of know there's bats, but you don't really think about them in your city, and they are in the city. We have probably six of the 9 species that are living in the city, and they're out there hunting. I've had bat detectors even in my own backyard in the suburban northwest Calgary, and I was getting about 20 bat passes a night, and I don't even have water nearby. I'm like, I don't know what these bats are doing, but I had a couple different species. So learning about your bats and being aware of them in your city, and demand protection for bats. I mean, they get overlooked because they're small and people, and like I said, people don't think about them as little flying grizzly bears that need their conservation concern, but they really are. And just be bat friendly whenever you can. Okay, so the last thing I always talk about is the rabies question, because people always worry about rabies in bats. So less than 0.5% of the free flying population will contract rabies. They die from rabies if they get it. It can vary from a few days to a couple of weeks where they might be sick, and then they actually will succumb to the disease. They don't carry the disease, although they can be infectious while they have it. So any bearskin contact with a bat or any wildlife, like any mammal, you should contact a medical professional, especially if it's a bite. And Alberta has a rabies hotline that you can call and get more information. Now, the thing with bats, with rabies, is that there's excellent pre and post exposure vaccines. It's a series of shots that you get, and they're only tiny shots. They're not giant ones. You just get a little shot in your arm. It's not a big deal. But once you start exhibiting symptoms, they can't do anything for you, and it's fatal. So I have very low risk tolerance for this kind of thing. So it's like whenever, if someone sent me this picture, like where there's a bat in their hand, this one's a bat biting the hand, but even worse. I would say immediately go, wash with soap and water for 15 minutes is what the recommendation is. And then seek a medical professional and get your post-exposure shots. And then it actually is very, very, I don't know of anybody that where it wasn't effective in taking the vaccine. If you refuse the vaccine, though, you will die if it was rabies exposure. But it has to be, it's transferred through saliva. So you actually have to touch the animal. So if you have any bearskin contact, that's when I say you should go see a medical professional. But if you don't touch them, they're just flying around or doing their bat things, there's no risk. Or if you move one and you wear a big glove, again, you've not had bearskin contact, there's no risk. So just keep in touch. No touch is no risk. So you can manage it safely. So just thank you for your time. I don't know if I've gone over. I often do. I kind of babble on a lot. These are all the people that submitted pictures for me. And these are all of the organizations that support us. So yeah, I've got some time for questions. If you still can, if you want to stay with us for a little longer.
Perfect. Great talk there, Susan. Lots of good, interesting information. And we did get a few questions that came through while you were talking. The first question that came out quite early was a lady who has a friend that eliminated some bats that were roosting on her wall. And she wanted to know about tips about helping bats in your community. And I think you basically just finished off your talk with a whole bunch of interesting tips.
Yeah, well, often, so there's a certain time of year where we get a lot of calls about bats. And it's in the spring where they're moving between their winter site to the summer site. And sometimes they'll be roosting on the sides of buildings. And it's a temporary roost. And usually if you wait a few days and it's warm weather, they will move on. If it's warm weather and they're still hanging there, that's when you need to call the wildlife rehabilitator, and they'll come and help. There's a couple of them in Calgary that will assist. And the same thing happens at the end of the season when they're leaving the summer roost and heading towards their winter sites. And then you'll see them sometimes in exposed places and weird places. And it could be juveniles at the end of the season that are underway.